Nobody noticed the single dad standing silently in the back of the boardroom while the CEO destroyed his career in front of everyone. She called him outdated, weak, and finished. Days later, he disappeared and bought the city's most abandoned warehouse, a place even billionaires refused to touch. People laughed until trucks began arriving at midnight. Investors started changing sides, and the CEO realized too late that the man she humiliated wasn't broken. He was building something massive. Now the empire she spent 10 years creating is collapsing piece by piece. And the only person powerful enough to save it is the rival she created herself. The conference room on the 32nd floor of Meridian Logistics had floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the entire city. On clear mornings, you could see the harbor from there, the cranes, the container ships, the slow pulse of commerce moving through steel and salt water. Daniel Carter used to love that view. He had spent 16 years staring at it, solving problems no one else wanted to touch, building systems that kept the company breathing when nothing else worked. He was 42 years old, broad-shouldered but quiet, with the kind of steady eyes that came from years of watching things carefully rather than reacting fast. His hair had started going gray at the temples after his wife, Margaret, passed away 3 years earlier from an illness that took 14 months to win. Since then, he had shown up to work every single morning, dropped his daughter Sophie off at school, and done his job without complaint. He never asked for recognition. He never asked for much at all. That turned out to be a mistake. Amelia Stone had taken over as CEO 8 months ago at 36 years old. Arriving from a venture-backed consulting firm with a track record of cutting costs and a reputation for zero tolerance, she was sharp, fast, and fluent in the language of disruption. She believed, with the conviction of someone who had never been wrong in public, that sentiment was inefficiency wearing a mask. She had walked into Meridian, looked at the org chart, and immediately identified what she called dead-weight people who had been in the same roles too long, who moved too slowly, who asked too many questions about risk. She had a point, sometimes, but she also had a habit of mistaking caution for cowardice and experience for obsolescence. Daniel Carter was the clearest example of both mistakes at once. The quarterly operations review that Thursday morning started at 9. 30 people filled the room. Daniel sat near the back, as he usually did, with a thin folder of notes in front of him. He had flagged 3 supply chain vulnerabilities in a report, submitted 2 weeks prior gaps in the Eastern distribution network that, if left unaddressed, would cost the company millions in the following fiscal year. Nobody had responded to the report. He had assumed it was being reviewed. He had assumed wrong. Amelia opened the meeting with slides. Clean, aggressive, full of arrows pointing upward. She talked about growth targets and market capture and the need for the company to move faster than it ever had before. Then she pulled up a slide with a single red circle on it. Inside the circle was Daniel's department. She looked at the room, let the silence do its work, and began. She said his systems were outdated by industry standards. She said his processes had not evolved in 3 years. She said the Eastern distribution delays, the very ones he had flagged in his ignored report, were the direct result of his department's failure to adapt. She did not read the report. She did not ask him whether he had already identified the problem. She presented the failure as his creation and herself as the solution, and she did it in front of every senior manager in the building. Daniel raised his hand once. She talked over him. He tried again, quietly, and said there were structural risks in the acceleration plan. She was proposing that moving too fast on the Eastern network without rebuilding the routing infrastructure first would create bottlenecks worse than the ones she was blaming him for. She looked at him the way someone looks at a door that won't close properly. Flat. Dismissive. Final. Daniel, she said, and the room went very still. This company doesn't need historians. It needs people who can move. She set down her clicker. She did not raise her voice. She didn't need to. You're finished. The silence that followed was complete. Not a chair shifted. Not a pen clicked. 30 people looked at their hands or their screens or the middle distance, doing the quiet calculus of self-preservation that happens whenever power speaks and no one challenges it. Daniel sat still for a moment. Then he closed his folder, stood up, buttoned his jacket out of habit, and walked out of the room without a word. He took the elevator down alone. He turned in his badge at the security desk. He walked to his car in the parking garage and sat behind the wheel for a long time without starting the engine. The city hummed around him. The morning went on without him. He had 16 years in that building, and nothing in his hands to show for them. He drove home a different way than usual, taking the long route along the waterfront road. He wasn't sure why. Maybe he needed more time before he had to explain anything to Sophie. Maybe he just needed to drive. He had just crossed the old industrial district near the port when he saw it set back from the road behind a chain-link fence, enormous and gray and broken, a warehouse the size of a city block with half its windows boarded up and the other half open to the sky. He pulled over without deciding to. He sat there looking at it for a long time. Something shifted in his face, something that had not moved in 3 years. 2 days later, Daniel drove back to the warehouse. This time he brought Sophie. She was 12, quiet and observant, with her mother's eyes and her father's patience. She looked at the chain-link fence, the cracked concrete, the rust-stained loading bays large enough to swallow semi-trucks. She looked at her father. "Dad," she said slowly, "why are we here?" Daniel didn't answer right away. He got out of the car, walked to the fence, and pressed his fingers against the chain link, the way you press your hand against the glass of something you want to understand. He stood there and looked at the building for almost a full minute before he spoke. "Because no one else sees what I see," he said. "The warehouse had a name. Once. Hartwell Distribution Center, the largest regional logistics hub on the eastern seaboard for nearly a decade. Processing millions of packages a year through a network that 6 other companies depended on. Then, in 2015, a financial scandal collapsed the parent company practically overnight. The CEO had been cooking the books for years. The hub closed in 72 hours. Contracts evaporated. The infrastructure, the conveyor systems, the dock doors, the routing hardware was stripped out and sold at auction. What remained was the shell, 47,000 square feet of reinforced concrete, steel frame construction, and a loading capacity that no new development in the area could match. It sat on 12 acres of industrial-zoned land, 2 miles from the port, directly adjacent to 3 major highway interchange points. Every commercial developer who had looked at it in the past 9 years had walked away. The cleanup costs were too high. The neighborhood was too depressed. The upside was too uncertain. It had been sitting there, slowly absorbing rain and graffiti, and the particular silence of things the world has given up on. Daniel had done his research in those 2 days. He knew the outstanding tax liens down to the dollar. He knew the structural inspection reports from 2018, which showed the foundation and frame in better condition than the exterior suggested. He knew the current assessed value versus the actual market value, versus what it could be worth if the routing infrastructure were rebuilt from scratch with modern systems. He had a number in his head. It was almost exactly the amount in his savings account, the money he and Margaret had set aside over 12 years for the future they were building together. The future that had changed its shape entirely. He spent one night going over the numbers again and again, checking them from different angles the way he always checked things, methodically and without drama. In the morning, he called a real estate attorney and made an offer. His friend Marcus, who worked in finance and had known Daniel for 20 years, called him the same afternoon the offer was accepted. "Tell me you didn't," Marcus said. Daniel told him he did. There was a long silence on the line. "Danny, that's your life savings. That's a condemned building in a flood zone, next to a port that lost its biggest tenant." Daniel said he knew. Marcus said, "They're going to think you've lost your mind." Daniel said, "Probably." He thanked Marcus and ended the call. 2 days after that, word reached Amelia Stone through the informal network of gossip and mutual contacts that connects every business community. She heard the name. She heard the address. She laughed, briefly and without warmth. The way you laugh at something so absurd it doesn't even register as a threat. "He bought garbage," she told her assistant, and moved on to her next meeting. She had no reason to think about Daniel Carter again. She was wrong about that too. The renovation started the following Monday. Daniel arrived at 6 in the morning with a contractor, a structural engineer, and a very long list. He did not announce anything. He did not put up a sign. He pulled the permits quietly, under a corporate name he had registered 3 weeks earlier, a name that meant nothing to anyone who might be watching. And at first, nobody was watching. The work began. The first thing the neighbors noticed was the lights. The old warehouse had been dark for nearly a decade. A black mass in the skyline that you stopped registering after a while. The way you stop registering anything permanent enough. But suddenly, at 10 o'clock, on a Tuesday night, the upper windows began to glow. Not the dim flicker of a work lamp, but something brighter, more purposeful. The kind of light that meant something serious was happening inside. A woman who lived in the apartment building across the street watched from her window for a while, then went to bed. Her neighbor, an older man who had spent 30 years working the docks, stood on his balcony for longer. He had seen that warehouse active once, in its best years. He recognized the rhythm of serious work even at a distance, the way the lights moved, the way vehicles came and went with deliberate precision. He went to bed thinking something was changing. He was right. By the third week, the pattern had established itself. Workers arrived before dawn and left well after midnight. Trucks came in 2 and 3 at a time along the access road that ran behind the building. Quiet enough, not to draw attention, but too frequent to miss entirely. The cargo those trucks carried was not the kind you could easily identify from outside. Large crates, long equipment cases, pallets wrapped in industrial shrink film. A forklift worked the loading bay in near silence, guided by a man in a yellow vest who moved with the economy of someone who had been doing this work for a long time. Inside, the building was transforming. The cracked concrete floors had been ground down and resealed. New electrical runs followed the ceiling joists like neat rivers of conduit. The dock doors had been replaced, all 16 of them, with hydraulic models that sealed tight and opened fast. A raised control room was being framed at the center of the floor, with floor-to-ceiling glass on 3 sides, so whoever worked there could see the entire operation at once. Daniel had not gone into the renovation blind. In the weeks after leaving Meridian, he had made calls. Quiet, careful calls to people he had worked with over 16 years, engineers who had moved on to other companies, logistics specialists who had left the industry out of frustration, tech developers he had consulted on side projects. He had one specific conversation that changed the direction of everything. He reached a man named Victor Reyes, who ran a 7-person startup building AI-powered routing software for mid-sized logistics operations. Victor had been trying for 2 years to find a facility willing to pilot his system at full scale. Every company he approached wanted the proof of concept before committing the space. Every facility required the software before committing the investment. It was the classic deadlock that kills good ideas quietly. Daniel called Victor and said he had the space. Victor drove out the following morning, walked through the empty warehouse, and stood in the middle of the floor looking up at the ceiling for a long time. Then he looked at Daniel and said, "When do we start?" The technology they were building together was not incremental. Victor's system used real-time data to reroute packages dynamically through the facility, adjusting flow, predicting bottlenecks before they formed, redistributing labor in response to volume fluctuations with a speed no human dispatcher could match. It was the kind of system that didn't require a massive existing operation to run. It was designed to outperform at smaller scale, which meant a new facility could compete with established giants from day one instead of waiting years to build volume. Daniel understood immediately what that meant. He had spent 16 years watching large operations fail because they were too rigid to adapt. He had watched Meridian, specifically, become too large and too slow to correct its own mistakes. The system Victor had built was the opposite of everything that had gone wrong. It was the thing Daniel had been imagining for years without knowing he was imagining it. Sophie came to the warehouse 3 afternoons a week after school. She did homework at a folding table in the corner of the control room, while her father walked the floor below, talking with contractors and engineers, pointing at walls and ceiling runs. making decisions with quiet authority. Sometimes she would look up from her books and watch him, and there was something in her face that was hard to name. Not pride exactly, more like recognition. The look of someone seeing something they already knew was true, finally being proven in the physical world. Sometimes she helped. She was good at organization, at labeling systems, at the kind of detail work that makes large operations function smoothly. She had, without either of them acknowledging it directly, become part of what he was building. Meanwhile, 7 miles away in the 32nd floor office with the harbor view, Amelia Stone's company was beginning to make small, invisible errors. The Eastern Distribution Network, the one Daniel had warned about, the one she had accelerated over his objection, was showing the first signs of the strain he had predicted. Delivery windows were widening. Rerouting delays were increasing. The errors were small enough that they didn't trigger immediate alarms, but they were accumulating in the data the way small cracks accumulate in concrete, quietly, steadily, in a direction that only ends one way. And somewhere in that data, without fanfare or announcement, a large client account went very quiet. No complaints, no escalation. Just a gradual slowing of order volume that, if you weren't watching carefully, looked like normal, seasonal variation. It wasn't. Amelia Stone noticed the account irregularity on a Wednesday morning in the middle of her second cup of coffee. She had a sharp eye for numbers, and the discipline to read her own dashboards, rather than wait for her team to flag things, which was one of the genuinely good qualities she possessed. She pulled the account history for Harrington Group, a regional retail chain that had been one of Meridian's most reliable clients for 6 years, and saw the slope of the volume curve. Down, not dramatically, but persistently, over 11 weeks. She called her head of client relations, a careful man named Robert, and asked for an explanation. Robert said Harrington hadn't given one. They were simply routing a portion of their volume elsewhere. He did not know where. It took her team 4 days to find the answer. It came through a logistics industry contact who had heard something at a trade event, a new facility near the port, handling Harrington's Eastern Corridor volume, delivering in windows that Meridian's current infrastructure couldn't match. The contact sent a name. The corporate name meant nothing to Amelia at first. She asked for an address. When the address came back, she sat very still for a moment. Then she asked for the name of the operator. When that name came back, she sat still for longer. Daniel Carter. The man she had dismissed 8 months ago. The man who had bought garbage. She felt something she was not accustomed to feeling, a specific, unpleasant tightening that came from being surprised by something she should have seen coming. She closed the file and opened it again, as if the information might be different the second time. It wasn't. By the time she had confirmed it, 2 other clients had quietly reduced their Meridian volume by measurable amounts. The board had not yet noticed. Her CFO had flagged the Eastern Corridor delays as a Q3 risk item, but had not connected them to the competitive threat. Amelia had a narrow window in which to act before the situation became visible to people who would ask uncomfortable questions. She called a strategy session with her senior team and laid out the situation in clinical terms. A new competitor had entered the market, was undercutting on delivery speed and cost, and needed to be addressed. She did not say who the competitor was. She did not say she had personally dismissed the man who was now competing with her. Inside the meeting, her team proposed the standard responses: aggressive pricing, accelerated infrastructure investment, client retention programs. Amelia approved all of it, but she also approved something else, quietly and separately, through channels she did not document. She reached out to 2 former Meridian employees who had connections to the new facility and offered them generous consulting contracts in exchange for information. She authorized her communications team to push a story vague, deniable, but persistent through industry contacts, suggesting that the new warehouse near the port had structural safety concerns that hadn't been publicly disclosed. It was not a strategy she was proud of. She had told herself, when she became CEO, that she would win through performance. But performance, at this particular moment, was not cooperating. Daniel heard about the safety rumor on a Tuesday. One of his contractors mentioned it, casually, over coffee. had heard something through a construction industry contact about concerns being raised. Daniel listened without expression. He thanked the man and moved on. He did not call anyone. He did not issue a statement. He filed the appropriate safety certifications with the relevant municipal office the following morning, making them publicly accessible through the standard record system, and returned to work. 2 days later, a mid-size institutional investor who had been watching the new facility with quiet interest published a short note in an industry newsletter. The note was 4 paragraphs long. It said the Hartwell redevelopment was demonstrating logistics performance metrics that exceeded regional benchmarks by a significant margin. It noted the AI routing system as a genuine competitive differentiator. It ended with a single line that Amelia's assistant printed out and left on her desk without comment. The line read, "Daniel Carter is the future of regional logistics infrastructure." Amelia read the line 3 times. Then she picked up her phone and called her assistant. "Get me everything there is on Carter's background," she said. "Education, work history, everything before Meridian." Her assistant said she would. Amelia hung up and looked out the window at the harbor. For the first time in 8 months, she felt the particular discomfort of not knowing something important that she should have known all along. What Amelia's research team found took 2 days to compile and about 15 minutes to read. The file was not long, but it was thorough. Daniel Carter had graduated with honors from a logistics and supply chain management program at a state university, then spent 3 years at a freight coordination firm in the Midwest before joining Meridian at 26. In his first 4 years there, before his name became associated with middle management and steady competence, he had done something remarkable that had since been buried under a decade of organizational restructuring and personnel turnover. He had designed the core operating architecture of Meridian's Eastern distribution network, not contributed to it, designed it. The routing logic, the tier structure, the vendor integration framework, the foundational systems that the company still ran on, that Amelia had been criticizing as outdated, without knowing who had built them or why they had been built the way they were. She had been calling Daniel outdated. She had been standing on ground he had laid. The reason none of this was visible in his recent record was the same reason Daniel had gone from lead architect to quiet operations manager Margaret. She had been diagnosed when Sophie was 7 years old. It was not a sudden thing. It developed over months, then consumed years. Treatment, remission, recurrence. Daniel had never asked Meridian for special accommodation. He had simply, quietly, stepped back from the trajectory his career had been on. He turned down a VP offer in 2018 because accepting it would have required travel he couldn't do, while Sophie needed consistency and Margaret needed someone present. He stopped raising his hand for the high-profile projects. He managed his department with the same competence he had always had, but he stopped being visible in the way the company rewarded. By the time Amelia arrived, he was simply a middle manager in a department that wasn't growing fast enough. She had no context for what she was looking at. She had fired a man she hadn't understood. Amelia sat with the file for a long time after reading it. She had a particular quality, one that she would not have described as a virtue, but that functioned like one of being honest with herself when she was alone. Not in front of others, not in meetings or strategy sessions, but alone, in her office with the door closed and the city spread out below her. She was capable of looking at a situation clearly. She looked at it now. She had walked into a room, identified a man based on surface signals, dismissed him publicly, and accelerated the exact risk he had tried to warn her about. The Eastern network failure that was now costing her clients and eroding her board's confidence was not an accident of bad luck or market forces. It was, in substantial measure, the result of a decision she had made in a conference room, while 30 people watched, and no one objected. She had been wrong. She had been wrong loudly and publicly, and at someone else's expense, and the account was now coming due. At the warehouse, Sophie had asked her father a question one evening while they were packing up after a long day. She was leaning against the wall of the control room, watching him go over routing data on a laptop, and she said quietly, the way she asked the questions that mattered, "Why didn't you tell them who you really are? At Meridian, I mean. Why didn't you just show them what you built?" Daniel looked up from the screen. He thought about it for a moment the way he always thought about things, not performing consideration but actually doing it. Then he said, "Because real value doesn't need to shout." Sophie looked at him with her mother's eyes. She seemed to be deciding whether she believed that. She was 12 years old, and not entirely sure yet whether patience was wisdom or just delay. But she wrote it down in the small notebook she kept in her bag. The one where she kept things she wanted to remember. She wrote it down and didn't say anything more. 3 weeks later, on a cold Thursday afternoon, a car Amelia Stone didn't usually drive pulled into the access road behind the Hartwell facility. She had come alone, without her assistant or her driver. She sat in the parking lot for a few minutes before getting out. Then she walked to the main entrance and asked for Daniel Carter. He met her in the doorway of the control room, above the main floor. Below them, the facility was running conveyors moving, workers directing flow, screens showing the live routing data in real time. It was nothing like she had imagined when she heard the address. It was nothing like the garbage she had dismissed. The floor was clean and bright. The systems hummed with the particular quality of things that were working exactly as intended. The scale of what he had built in 8 months, with resources that amounted to a fraction of what she managed annually, was something she absorbed in silence for a long time before speaking. Daniel stood beside her and watched her take it in and said nothing. He waited the way he had always waited, not to make a point, but because he had learned long ago that silence was often more honest than words. Amelia made her offer directly, without warm-up or softening. She said Meridian was prepared to acquire the facility and the routing system at a significant valuation. She named a number that would have been life-changing for most people. She said the integration would be seamless, that his team would be protected, that she was prepared to offer him a senior role in the merged organization. She had rehearsed this. She presented it the way she presented every offer, clean, confident, with the implicit assumption that the logic of the deal would close it. Daniel let her finish. Then he said, "No." Amelia had not genuinely expected a no. She recalibrated quickly, the way she always did, and pushed, reframing the offer, adjusting terms, emphasizing the market advantages of consolidation. Daniel listened politely. He did not interrupt. When she stopped, he said no again, with the same quiet finality as the first time. Amelia felt something she recognized as the precursor to losing control, a specific pressure behind her composure, a narrowing of her patience. She turned to face him fully. "You're doing this for revenge," she said. It was less an accusation than a release valve. Daniel looked at her without sharpness, without heat, with the steady eyes that had always unsettled people who expected anger in the places he kept calm. "No," he said. "I'm doing this because you underestimated people. Not just me. All of them." He gestured at the floor below them, the workers, the systems, the whole visible architecture of something built by people she had dismissed or never noticed at all. "You looked at a room full of them and saw overhead." Amelia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You think I don't know that?" And there was something in her voice that was different from the boardroom voice, from the CEO voice, something smaller and less managed, that she usually would not have let into a professional conversation. Daniel noticed it. He filed it away. They stood together at the glass for another few minutes, looking down at the operation, and the conversation moved into the kind of negotiating territory that was less about deals than about two people who understood logistics trying to explain their reasoning to each other. They argued, technically and sharply, about routing architecture, about infrastructure investment cycles, about the risks of both consolidation and fragmentation. Amelia, it turned out, was not wrong about everything. She was very good at certain kinds of analysis. She was simply missing the dimension of things she had never bothered to learn. When she left, an hour later, nothing had been agreed. No deal had been made, but something had shifted, slightly, in the way she was thinking. She drove back toward the city in the gathering dark, and for the first time in a long time, she was not entirely sure she was right. She found out what had happened to her company's system at 2 o'clock in the morning. The call came from her head of IT on a Tuesday night. The Eastern distribution system, the accelerated infrastructure she had pushed through over Daniel's objection, had suffered a cascading failure in its routing software. It was not a cyber attack. It was not sabotage. It was the precise thing Daniel had warned about in a report she had never read. The new acceleration had been layered over an outdated integration framework that could not sustain the load under peak conditions. The peak had arrived. The system had collapsed. By 3 in the morning, 7,000 packages were unrouted. By 5, the number was 63,000. By the time Amelia arrived at the office at 6, her phone had not stopped since 2 clients, board members, her CFO, the head of the industry association, a journalist who had somehow heard already, asking for comment on what one logistics trade newsletter was calling a catastrophic operational failure. Her PR team arrived an hour after she did. Her legal team arrived an hour after that. The board convened an emergency session at 10 that morning. Amelia sat at the head of the table and presented the situation with the clarity and composure she had trained herself to deliver, even when everything was collapsing. She outlined the failure, the scope, the remediation timeline. She accepted responsibility without drama. She was, in that specific moment, exactly what a CEO is supposed to be in a crisis: clear, present, honest about the damage. The board appreciated the composure. They were less appreciative of the underlying cause, which had been documented in a risk assessment submitted months ago by an employee she had publicly dismissed. One board member, a woman named Patricia, who had been on the Meridian board for 11 years and had seen 3 CEOs navigate crises, asked a single question. The report identifying this risk, she said, was submitted by Daniel Carter. "Is that correct?" Amelia said yes. Patricia looked at her for a moment, without expression, and he was let go, Patricia said. It was not a question. The stock dropped 6% at opening. By midday it had recovered 2 points, but the trajectory was visible. Institutional holders were watching. The trade press was running the story of the failure alongside the background on Daniel's departure, drawing a line between those two events in a way that was impossible to dispute. Social media amplified it. Industry contacts who had seen Daniel's facility firsthand began giving interviews, carefully worded but pointed. The phrase, "preventable failure," appeared in enough places, enough times, to become the story. Amelia's communications team worked all day trying to manage the narrative. The narrative did not want to be managed. It had too many facts supporting it. By the end of the second day, 2 senior executives had submitted their resignations. 3 more were quietly making calls. The board had scheduled a formal review for the following week. The clients whose volume had quietly migrated to the Hartwell facility were now openly discussing expanding those commitments. A competitor 2 states over issued a release announcing they were expanding regional operations, which in context read as a direct signal to Meridian's clients that alternatives existed. Amelia had been in the business long enough to recognize the shape of what was happening. She had watched it happen to other people from a safe distance and had made confident notes about what those people had done wrong. Now she was inside it. The distance was gone. She was awake at 2 in the morning for the 4th night in a row, sitting in her office with the lights low, and she found herself thinking about something Daniel had said in the warehouse, something she had dismissed in the moment as sentiment. He had said, "The people in this building are the reason it works." She had heard that as weakness. She was no longer sure she had heard it right. She had spent 10 years building something she was proud of. She had made it faster and leaner and more profitable than it had ever been. She had also made it brittle in ways she had not understood until it broke. The thing she had called finished was not broken. The thing she had built was. And underneath the exhaustion and the pressure and the specific loneliness that comes from being wrong in a very visible way, Amelia Stone felt something she had not allowed herself to feel since she was 22 years old and working her first entry-level job in a city that didn't care about her. She felt afraid, and she had no idea what to do with it. On Friday evening, it was raining. She drove to his house without calling first. She stood on the front porch in the rain and rang the bell, and Sophie answered the door. Sophie looked at her for a long moment, at the expensive coat soaked through at the shoulders. at the face that was not composed the way it had been in the warehouse, and said, "Just a minute," and went to get her father. Daniel came to the door in a gray sweater, still holding a dish towel. He looked at Amelia. He said nothing. She stood in the rain and said, "I need your help." Her voice was even. She was not going to fall apart on a stranger's porch. But there was something underneath the evenness that she could not hide entirely, a quality of rawness, of something scraped down to its real surface, that changed the sound of the words. Not for a deal, not for an acquisition. I just need someone who understands what broke to help me fix it before the people who work in that building lose everything. She stopped. She took a breath. I know I have no right to ask. Daniel looked at her for a long moment in the rain. He said nothing. Then Sophie's voice came from somewhere behind him, not loud, not directed at anyone, the way children say things that land exactly because they're not trying to. Mom used to say strong people help even when they're hurt. The rain fell steadily on the porch steps. Amelia looked at the door. Daniel looked at his daughter, somewhere out of sight in the hallway, and something in his face moved in a way that had nothing to do with Amelia Stone, or Meridian Logistics, or the logistics industry at all. He stood there for a moment with his daughter's voice in the air, and his wife's words in it. And he made the decision that he had probably already made before Amelia arrived. He told her to come inside. He made coffee. They sat at the kitchen table, the CEO whose empire was collapsing, and the man she had called finished, and they talked until nearly midnight. Amelia told him the full scope of the failure. She told him about the board review. She told him about the resignations and the client conversations and the stock trajectory. She told him what her team had tried and where they had hit walls. She was precise and thorough and honest in a way she was rarely honest with anyone, partly from desperation and partly because something in the plainness of the kitchen and the quiet of the house made performance feel exhausting. Partway through, she stopped in the middle of a sentence and said, quietly, "I'm scared." Daniel looked at her. He said, "I know." She looked at the table. "I've been scared this whole time," she said, "since day one. I just thought if I moved fast enough it would look like confidence. And eventually, it would turn into confidence." Daniel said, "Sometimes it does." She said, "Not this time." He said, "No, not this time." They sat with that for a moment, and then Daniel pulled out a notepad and said, "Okay, show me the architecture." In the morning, he drove to Meridian. He had not walked through those doors since the day he left. He entered through the main lobby, and the woman at the security desk recognized him immediately. She called him Mr. Carter and issued him a visitor badge with a warmth that had nothing to do with his official status. Just with the fact that she remembered him as someone who had always said, "Good morning," and meant it. He took the elevator to the operations floor, not the executive floor. And when the doors opened, he was met by a silence that was different from the silence of an empty room. It was the silence of people who had been under pressure for days and were running on coffee and anxiety, and the particular gallows humor of teams in crisis. 3 of his former direct reports were there. When they saw him, one of them, a young logistics analyst named Kevin, stood up from his desk. He didn't say anything. He just stood up, the way you stand up when something you'd stopped expecting walks back into the room. Daniel set his bag down at an open workstation, looked at the system display, and began. He did not make announcements. He did not give a speech. He looked at the architecture of the failure the way he had always looked at broken things, without blame, without sentiment, with the clean attention of someone who just wanted to understand the problem well enough to fix it. He asked questions. He listened to answers. He drew diagrams. He asked more questions. He identified 3 critical intervention points in the routing logic that, if addressed in sequence, would start clearing the backlog without destabilizing the parts of the system that were still functional. He assigned work to the people in the room with the same quiet authority. He had always had, not the authority of title, but the authority of someone who understood the thing better than anyone else present, and was not using that understanding to establish hierarchy, but simply to solve the problem. By the afternoon, the backlog was moving. Not cleared, that would take days, but moving. which meant the trajectory had changed. Clients who had been calling every 4 hours started calling every 8. The board received an update that used the word stabilizing for the first time since the failure. Amelia watched from the doorway of the operations floor for a long time without entering, and what she watched was not the system recovering. It was the way the people in the room were working, the change in the room from Wednesday to Thursday, from dread to focus, from individuals managing their own panic to something that looked, for the first time in days, like a team. Daniel had not told anyone to feel that way. He had not given a speech about culture or resilience or the importance of human capital. He had sat down at a workstation and done excellent work, and the people around him had felt it and responded to it the way people always respond to someone who actually knows what they're doing. They lifted. Amelia stood in the doorway and thought about the things she had said in that conference room 8 months ago. How the room had gone still. How nobody had moved. She thought about the 16 years this man had spent building the ground she was standing on, and how she had walked in and dismissed him in front of 30 people without knowing any of it. She felt the weight of that in a specific, physical way, not guilt exactly, more like a debt you have been carrying without knowing it, and someone has just put a number on it. When the board called that evening to tell her they were convening the formal review in 48 hours, she told them there was something she needed to say first. Daniel was packing up to leave when Amelia came to the workstation. She stood beside him and watched him for a moment, and then said, "The board wants you to come back as CEO." Daniel kept packing. "I know," he said. "Word travels." She said, "It would solve the problem." He said, "No, it wouldn't." She said, "What?" He looked at her. Replacing one person isn't a solution. The system has to actually change. The culture has to change. He said it without accusation, just as observation, the way he said most things. That's a longer project than fixing the routing software. Amelia said, "So what are you saying?" Daniel said, "I'm saying, I'll help you get it stable. I'll consult on the structural rebuild if you want, but I'm not coming back here." He closed his bag. "I'm not what Meridian needs. You need someone who wants to be here. And I found out that I already am somewhere." Amelia was quiet. Then she asked the question that had been underneath everything for the past 2 days. She asked it without strategy, without framing, with the directness of someone who had run out of performance. "After everything," she said, "after what I did to you in that room, why did you help?" Daniel picked up his bag. He thought about Sophie at the kitchen table. He thought about Margaret's voice in his daughter's words. He thought about the warehouse at midnight, the lights coming on in the windows of something the world had given up on. "Because destroying people is easy," he said. "Building them is harder." He looked at her one more time, not with warmth exactly, but with something that was not its opposite. Then he walked to the elevator. The board met on a Monday morning. Amelia Stone walked in and sat down and said everything she had prepared to say, and then she said a few things she had not prepared. She told them about the report. She told them about Daniel's warning and her decision to override it. She told them that the failure of the Eastern Network was not a market anomaly or a technology problem. It was a leadership error, and it was hers. She said this clearly and completely, and without asking for anything in return. The room was quiet for a long time after. Then she said she was resigning as CEO, effective at the end of the quarter, and that she would spend those months doing everything in her power to ensure a stable transition. She recommended that the board consider seriously the kind of leadership that had walked back into the operations floor on Thursday and turned the room around without raising his voice, and she left the decision about what to do with that observation entirely to them. She walked out of the board meeting into a hallway that was very quiet. Her assistant was waiting with a coffee. She took it and stood by the window and looked out at the city and felt something she had not expected, not relief, not grief, but something cleaner than either. The feeling of a thing being named accurately. The board did approach Daniel. He took the call and listened to the full offer and thanked them with the sincerity he brought to most things. Then he declined. He said he had thought about it seriously, and that he was grateful for the consideration, but that his answer was no. The person they were looking for was out there. It was not him. He had something he needed to finish. He ended the call, picked up his daughter from school, and drove to the warehouse. He had a systems review scheduled with Victor at 4 o'clock and dinner to make afterward, and the spring afternoon was the kind that made the harbor look like something in a painting, flat and silver and full of light. The months that followed moved the way good work. The Hartwell facility signed 3 mid-size regional clients in the first quarter and 2 larger ones by the summer. Victor's routing system was being discussed in trade publications as a model for the next generation of logistics infrastructure. A regional development fund provided a significant investment that allowed a second phase of construction, a temperature-controlled section for pharmaceutical and perishable goods that had been in the plans since the beginning. Daniel hired 40 people in that period, nearly all of them from Meridian or from the community around the old industrial district, people for whom the work mattered in both directions. He ran meetings standing up, at the glass rail above the floor, where everyone could see the operation moving below them. He did not have a corner office. He had a desk in the corner of the control room, where Sophie did her homework 3 afternoons a week. Amelia Stone, in the months after her resignation, did something unexpected. She did not go to another company. She did not join a board or take a partner role at a consultancy. She went back to school not formally, but through the sustained and deliberate education of someone who has decided to understand the thing they got wrong. She reached out to people she had dismissed at Meridian and had honest conversations. She started a small project, an advisory practice, helping early-stage logistics companies avoid the operational mistakes she now understood from the inside. She was good at it in ways she had not been good at being CEO, because she was no longer performing certainty she didn't have. She called Daniel twice in that period. The first time was a brief, practical conversation about a former Meridian engineer she thought he might want to hire. The second time was harder to categorize. She called to say that she had been thinking about the warehouse, about the day she had walked in and seen what he had built, and she wanted him to know that she understood now what she had walked past for 8 months without seeing. Daniel listened. He said, "I know." He meant it without warmth and without coldness, in the exact tone of someone who has moved forward and is not pulling the past back for the pleasure of it. Sophie was 13 by then, almost 14. She was taking an interest in supply chain mathematics, which her teacher said was unusual for her age. She came to the warehouse on Saturdays sometimes and worked with Victor on routing logic, learning the system from the inside, with the focused patience of someone who had grown up watching her father solve problems quietly and understood, without anyone explaining it, that the quiet was the point. She still kept her small notebook. The entry about real value not needing to shout was still there, near the front. She had written below it, in smaller letters, something she hadn't said aloud. And the people who understand that are the ones worth watching. The Hartwell facility was officially renamed Carter Logistics in the second year of operation. Daniel resisted the name for longer than was reasonable and accepted it eventually because Victor and the team presented it as a fact rather than a suggestion, and he did not have a better argument. The sign went up on a Tuesday with no ceremony and no announcement. Just a few people standing in the parking lot looking at it before the workday started. Daniel looked at it for a moment, then he went inside. There was a routing problem that needed his attention. What Amelia Stone had built over 10 years did not collapse entirely. It was restructured, redirected, and absorbed new leadership that understood something she had not, that the people who move things, literally and figuratively, are not infrastructure. They are not overhead. They are not the kind of thing you can dismiss in a conference room in front of 30 silent people and expect to leave behind. The city's most abandoned warehouse became the city's most efficient logistics hub, and the man who had been told he was finished stood at the glass above the floor every morning, watching the operation run, and said nothing because there was nothing that needed to be said. The man she called finished became the reason her empire survived. Not because he was powerful, not because he was vengeful, not because he had something to prove, because when someone handed him nothing, he found out what he was made of without an audience. And that, it turned out, was enough to build everything.